So today I'm doing something a little different. I'm putting together a PC from parts, and this is for my personal use. It's for video editing, it's for work when I work from home, and it's for possibly playing games and just general usage. I really love putting together PCs from parts. It's something I've always enjoyed since the 386, 486 days. So this video, I intend to unbox the items, discuss a little bit why I selected each of the parts, and then ultimately put it together and do a little testing outside of a case and make sure it works. So if you've already taken a look at the components I have assembled here, you may notice there's a couple of things missing. One of them is a case, and I do have a case, it's just that it didn't fit easily in this shot. And the other thing is a GPU, or video card, or graphics processing unit. I intend to get one at a later time. I just haven't decided yet what I need and how much I'm willing to spend, because as you may know, they're extremely expensive for higher end ones. This CPU has built-in graphics capability, so I should be able to build the PC and test it. It probably won't perform that great for anything intensive, gaming, video editing, that sort of thing, but I can at least test it to make sure all the components are working, which is my goal at this point. So if everything goes okay with this build, it's quite possible that, ironically, as you're watching it, it was edited on this PC after it gets built. So let's just discuss some of the parts that I put together here. One of my goals in building this system was not only to make a workstation that'll work well for me currently, but also that has a little bit of future proofing going ahead. And so that's why some of these choices were made. If we start with the motherboard, I kind of went with a slightly higher end model. It's definitely overkill for most gaming systems and so forth. But what I really liked about this ASRock Phantom Gaming X870E Nova is that it doesn't do really any lane sharing for anything that I'll be using. This is all stuff that I've just learned about recently. I'm certainly not a technological expert with all these factors, but basically it doesn't do any lane sharing between any of the M.2 NVMe slots and the PCIe 5 slot for the GPU, etc. So it just has the flexibility to allow you to run lots of devices off this board all at full speed. So of course the choice to go with this motherboard is done in parcel with really the choice to go with AMD Ryzen in general for the CPU, because of course the motherboard needs to match the CPU in terms of supporting the socket. I decided to go with AMD Ryzen. There's really lots of reasons for this, but one of the primary ones is that there's a little bit of future proofing that goes with this. AMD has committed to making CPUs that will fit in the AM5 socket through 2027 at least. So that's a very appealing thing. And I was a little bit pushed away by some of the problems that Intel has had with their previous generation processors. I decided to go with a Ryzen 9 9900X, mostly just it seemed like it was the best performance to cost ratio available right now, and this has 12 cores as opposed to 6 or 8 from the 5 and 7 series, and they do have 16 core processors, but the price jumped significantly, so this felt like a sweet spot to get a 12 core, I think 24 thread processor. This is really not a big deal for gaming. It would actually be better to go with one of the X3D processors for gaming. But I wanted something that's going to balance workstation capabilities. Using Premiere Pro for video editing, for instance, is very processor dependent or heavy. This should do a decent job for that. So next, memory. And I'm kind of notorious for not closing programs once I've opened them, leaving a million tabs open for browsers, etc. So I didn't really want to be short of memory, so I decided to go for 64 gigabytes, 2x32. Kingston Fury Beast, I think it is, DDR5, 6,000 megatransfers per second, CL30, if that means anything to you. This just seems like the sweet spot, again, of price to performance. And the other thing is I went for the lowest profile RAM that I could find, just not quite too tall this way, because the CPU cooler that I have apparently takes up a lot of space there and doesn't allow for large RAM chips. So hopefully this will fit. We shall see. Next is storage, and basically any NVMe or M.2 that is PCIe 4.0 seems like the way to go these days. Even though the board supports 5.0, as well as some slots and 4.0. There's really not any noticeable performance benefit at this point with using 5.0. The cost is significant. It's well over double for the same amount of storage to go for 5 at this point. So this is a 4.0 card, as you see, up to 7,300 megabytes per second. Also, this card has DRAM, I believe it is, and so it buffers a bit better. So I think, again, I don't know exactly how that translates, but I think it's if you're doing large transfers, it won't sort of bottleneck. So, and the intent is for this to just be the OS drive, maybe the applications, and then I probably will have other drives that I add at a later time for video storage, etc. So next is the power supply. And some of the factors I considered here, wanting to get a brand name. It's 850 watts. There's a little bit of hopefully future proofing involved there. I figure I'm only going to need really about, I could have gotten away with a 650 watt one, but I don't know for sure yet what GPU I'm going to add, and so that could change the situation a little bit. This one's fully modular, so no cables are attached directly to the chassis. They all plug in, which I like the flexibility of that. This one is also ATX 3.1 capable, so it has the extra 12 volt, I think it's 2x6 cable that's some of the newer GPUs need. So again, a little bit of future proofing. Even if I go with a lower level GPU for now, you know, if I end up using this board to upgrade the CPU in the coming years, hopefully this PSU will also support what I need for a GPU upgrade. So next comes the CPU cooler. So this is the Peerless Assassin 120 SE Black. From what I've been researching, this seems to be one of the better, again, cost to performance ratios you can find in a sort of passive CPU cooler. It's rather large, but it should fit fine in the case. Like I said, there's potentially some clearance issues over the RAM, but we shall see when I try to put it all together. And so that's basically it for what I have at the moment. As I mentioned, I've already got a case. I have yet to get a GPU, but the CPU does have GPU capability built in, so we should be able to unbox this and set it up just temporarily outside the case, test it, and make sure everything is working. Okay, let's start with the motherboard. This motherboard is actually fairly difficult to get. It's been out of stock for quite a while in Canada. When I found one come available, I jumped at it. So let's open this up, take a look at it. Antenna for Wi-Fi. Motherboard. Looks like some cables. I think those are SATA cables. And some manual. These are cables, like header cables, I believe, for the motherboard pins. Quite nice looking. I'm not going to be taking any of the plastic off for this point. I just want to do testing. It supports a total of 5 M.2 NVMe cards under here, one under this heatsink, and then there's another 4. I think it looks like there's one under there, and then there's another 3 somewhere, I believe, under here. GPU, PCIe 5.0 slot. I think this is an X1 and X4 slot, if I'm not mistaken. Debug code. Power on and off and reset button on the board. Super powerful VRM, overkill really, 20 by 4 by 1 or something like that. But again, hopefully future proof for potentially higher power CPUs. AM5 slot, as mentioned, RGB and audio capability built in, etc., etc. All the sort of usual stuff. This card has an easy release button here, or lever, I guess, for releasing the GPU card, just because with bigger GPUs, of course, they'll sit right over top of here and make it very hard to get to the traditional little release button that's right there. This is a good feature, although I'd like to see this actually not be spring-loaded so that you could just release it and leave it open and then use 2 hands to take the GPU in and out. This is certainly better than not having this lever. So next, let's unbox the Ryzen 9 9900X. Seems impossibly small. All right, I've never placed an AM5 processor in a socket before, so let's take a look at this. It's just the black plastic part that needs to be removed. That's just protecting the pins. There we go. So there is a particular orientation, and it's really just the way I've got it now. It's to be matched by the marking in the top left corner there, and the dot, and I guess the arrow that shows on the actual green board portion of the CPU. And there's all the contacts, not pins, on the other side. And then you can see the arrow in what's now the top right corner, which when I flip it over is going to be the top left. And so I should be able to place this right on here. Very gently. Give it a little wiggle, make sure it's nicely placed in there. Now, I understand this part can feel a little bit like you're going to break it because it requires a bit of force to press down on this. There we go. One thing I wanted to mention about this motherboard, before I go on, is, man, this thing is a tank. Super heavy. It's, I believe, an 8-layer PCB, which makes it, of course, heavier. But one of the other things about it is that it's actually got a like 3/4 backplate, which is quite impressive for a card of this type. I know one thing that's always made me nervous about putting power connectors and so forth on motherboards is that the board will bend, and I just wonder how many times you can get away with that before something gets damaged. But this thing is literally a tank, and so I would have no fear about pressing hard, getting the power connectors in and so forth. Of course, still got to be careful you don't break them off the board, but it's such that extra layer of confidence. Beefy, very beefy. Okay, so next is the installing the memory. Right here on the board, it tells you A1, A2, B1, B2, and it says to do A2 and B2 first. Oh, these don't bend back. These are different than what I'm used to. Oh, it's only on one end. There are no levers on this end, and the levers are on this end. So A2 and B2 are the places we're going to install the two DIMMs we have. So of course, it's very important to make sure that the little slot here in the memory card lines up with the little ridge in the center of these sockets. Easy thing to make a mistake on. So I should just be able to press this in. Quite a bit different than RAM that I've installed before. Usually you just have to press down, and both ends, this little lever will automatically pop up. Yeah, you really have to press that memory down. This doesn't seem as intuitive to me as the old system. I think that's finally in there properly. Those are all flush. So the next thing to do is install the storage, NVMe M.2 card. The space on the motherboard has heat sinks to accommodate both sides. There's of course this side and also the bottom here. I assume these are intended to be removed and stuck on. I'm not going to do that for now, just because I'm just testing the system. You can see there's a little notch there that shows you which way to actually install this. Now, is this toolless? After some fiddling, this little toolless thing turns. That has to go all the way down like that, and then this gets turned like that. And you can see that it just covers over the edge of the card, holding it in place. And let's put that back. The next thing is to get out the power supply. Interesting little case. All the power cords. Wow, there's a lot of them. And just a regular PC power cord and some screws. So that would appear to be the new ATX 3.1 cable. It says 600 watts on it, 2x6, nicely braided. It's time to make some fun connections here and do some testing, see if we can get this thing running. I do have, of course, this Thermalright Peerless Assassin 120 SE. I'm not actually going to connect it right now because I just want to see if this thing will boot. I have no OS installed or anything like that. Just want to make sure that the parts I have so far are working with no errors. On the motherboard here, I have HDMI cable out from the motherboard, which is going to use the onboard graphics of the Ryzen CPU. And I've got a keyboard plugged into USB. And then of course I've got my PSU here. I've got some cables out. This is the one I'm gonna need for the main power connector to the board. You may have noticed it's gotten a little darker and my lighting is not great here, so I'm using a headlamp. Let's see here. ATX 24 port. And this should be able to connect to ATX 24 port here. My motherboard has two 8-pin connectors up here, so I guess I will use these. They're a little different on each end, I'm realizing. This must be the end for the motherboard. This is the end for the power supply. Different sized clips. That one is modular, can be broken into 2 4s if your CPU requires it. This other cable looks to be the same. I think I should be able to try to power this up and see what we get. So switch on the power supply. I have lights. So in theory, this is one of the benefits now of having these buttons on the motherboard. I should be able to power it right from here without having to fiddle with jumpers or connect to a case. Okay, so it appears to have shut down and I've got no output to the display. I'm not sure why. Okay, so let's try again to see if we can boot this thing. I've been reading a bunch of stuff to make sure that my CPU is supported on this BIOS version. It is. Could be a memory stick not seated properly, so I've tried reseating them. I decided that the CPU does get pretty hot pretty quickly, at least at the touch. So I pulled out just the heat sink for the Thermalright Peerless Assassin, and I'm just going to place it on the CPU just to give it a chance. There's no thermal paste or anything, but just give it a chance to dissipate some of the heat. And let's try booting this again. All right, there we go, BIOS. That feels like a relief. I think I can go ahead and install all this in the case. So we've jumped ahead a little bit here. I have put the motherboard in the case. The case I decided to get is the Be Quiet Pure Base 500. Yeah, the motherboard was just mounted in there with 8 screws as normal. The little standoffs, metal standoffs, were already in place in the motherboard, so I just had to drop it in there and screw it down so far. So this case came with this white metal ring that attaches to the power supply. Most power supplies I had before, I had to slide them inside the case here and then screw them against the back. This one is the opposite with this ring. So I've got to feed the cables through. I've got some cables attached still, so I've got to feed those through, then install it through the back opening. So next I'd just like to prep the mounting brackets for the CPU cooler, the Thermalright Peerless Assassin. So first I have to take off these stock mounting brackets that come holding the backing plate in place. So the Thermal Assassin comes with mounting brackets They say AM4 on them. They work for both AM4 and AM5 sockets, this being AM5 of course. And it also comes with these little red standoffs that fit on right on here. So these hold the brackets at the right distance off of the motherboard for the cooler to connect to. The cooler of course comes with brackets for Intel mounting as well, which I won't need in this case. So the next step in installing the CPU cooler is to put some thermal paste on the CPU itself. Of course, that's to be squished out by this metal pad to make excellent thermal contact between the CPU and the cooler itself. I have never actually applied thermal paste before. I've always so far had pre-installed thermal paste on the coolers that I've had. There's the P method, the X method, there's lines, there's using some kind of little spatula to spread it out over the CPU. They all seem to have their pros and cons. I'm thinking that I'm gonna try the X method, as that seems to be effective. The other thing I've noticed with this Thermal Assassin is, first of all, the instructions are pretty weak that come with it. This thermal pad is offset slightly. It's not right in the center of these fins. So you can see hopefully that this pad is closer to this side. I think that is done to offset the cooler from the GPU so it doesn't get in the way of it. This ends up with the Thermalright logo being on the left-hand side of each of these cooling towers. So Thermalright did provide some paste in with the cooler. My initial thought is it looks like a fair amount, probably going to get a bit of a mess out of this. This design of AMD processors, the AM5 slot ones, they're pretty cool looking, no pun intended, but it also kind of lends itself to having a lot of bleed over that ends up down on the PCB. It's cosmetic only and won't be able to see it while the cooler's on. I'll only notice it the next time I take it off. So it kind of is what it is. You want to be able to screw it down in such a way as to put even pressure. Let's try to evenly screw this down. And I think this is one of those snug but not too tight kind of situations. I feel like I'm probably there. All right, next thing is to add the fans. The Peerless Assassin does come with a cable that's for connecting both fans to a single header on the motherboard. I happen to have two headers on the motherboard, so I don't really need this, and so I think I'll do them separately. I really want both fans to blow in this direction to aid the CPU heat from getting right out of the case. The logo part here is the direction that the air gets sucked in, and it gets blown out the back where there's part of the cage that holds the center part of the fan, the motor, together. So basically it has to go on this way. The way that this cooler is designed to be installed is one fan on the right side of the right tower and one fan in the center, both of them again blowing in this direction. Of course, there is a bit of a RAM clearance issue. It's not too bad, so it only sticks up like a tiny bit. The next thing I have to deal with is putting these clips on. So I just put one on as a sample. This gives you an idea of the direction it connects. There's holes on both sides of the fan, which makes it a little confusing. You need to install on the right-hand side of each fan and kind of clip these little things through. I've also got the orientation the way I want with the fan header over to the side I need. So again, here's the clip and it needs to snap over onto the fins here. So you have to pull it out a little bit and it just clips on just like that. Obviously I have to still connect the headers to the board. I'll do that and then continue with more cable connections. Okay, so hopefully you can actually see the fan headers here. There's 1 and 2, and this connector is for an AIO pump. And of course these connectors have ridges on them to ensure they match up with the plastic pin on the header. so you have to get everything lined up just properly. All right, so looking at the back of the case, here's some of the wiring that I'm dealing with. This is all the wiring from the PSU. And then there's wiring that comes with the case, which Be Quiet is mostly routed fairly neatly. The front fan header, they had it all the way up here, but then it's a little too short to actually get to the motherboard connector, so I've had to reroute it a little bit. The first thing, of course, is the main motherboard 24-pin connector. 4-pin connector at the top. I believe it will go on this way, and then it will wrap around like this. And then there is the USB header. So that's the USB connections on the front of the top of the case. And that is a little bit lower on the motherboard. And as mentioned before, this is the front case fan header. That goes right into the bottom of the motherboard. There's 3 holes under here that I can get these cables through. And this is the power switch and LEDs. Those are over on this corner of the motherboard. So they're gonna have to feed right in here. And the last cable for the case itself is HD audio for the microphone and headphone jack. And that is located over here, or at least on this corner. So that's gonna have to feed up through there. These are CPU cables. Only one of these is required, 8-pin minimum. And then some motherboards have another 4-pin one to plug in. This motherboard has 2 8-pin ones. I'm gonna plug them both in. I don't see a reason not to. I don't know why you'd want to deny the motherboard any power that it might actually want if it's being taxed. So these have to install all the way up in this corner of the motherboard. So they're gonna come right over through this gap here. So I'm just gonna stick those up there for now. I think I'll connect everything and then come back and dress this side a little bit. So something that wasn't obvious to me at the time of installing this, but this is what comes with experience. It would be much smarter to install those CPU connectors before installing the CPU cooler, simply because there's so little room to get your hands down here to work. That's okay. I should be able to make it work. If not, I could always take this off, but I would prefer not to, obviously. The CPU cables are now plugged in. It was very difficult to do. Definitely lesson learned for next time. So all the rest of the connectors are further down on the motherboard on the side or the bottom. The main 24-pin here's the USB 3 cable. The way this case is designed, it's great for hiding the cables and having a slot that they go into. It also does not give much clearance to actually plug things in. Okay, well, it turns out this USB header, the shape of the cable and the length of the molded plastic, it really would not go in there without some serious work. So there's another header down here, and although a bit more ugly to have this cable here, definitely easier to work on in the future. HD audio connector. That's the header right there. You can see there's 1 pin missing, so it's obvious which way it goes on. And of course, this is the front chassis fan right here. And this is also keyed. Even though it's a 4-pin connector, only 3 pins are needed because this one will not have speed control. The fan is either on or off based on whether there's power to the motherboard. So the other thing to deal with is the extractor fan. And this is one of my only 2 complaints so far about the ASRock Nova motherboard. In most motherboards, there's a header right here for this back chassis fan. And on the ASRock, they put it all the way at the bottom with the other headers. So routing this cable is a little bit of a pain. And then on top of that, the connector is way in the top back corner on the fan. I'm hoping the cable's long enough, it should be. So it has to get all the way to there. I'm thinking if I can go underneath the fan like this. So yeah, not too pretty. One small thing ASRock could do to improve this board. I have to connect the chassis power button and LED. As you can see, it goes on this header right in the bottom right corner of the motherboard, and that's the pin out. So yeah, it looks like the power LED I'm gonna have to put on the top 2, positive, negative, and then the power button is these 2, positive, negative. Okay, so now I've actually got power into the power supply, and there's the switch on, and we did get power to the power and reset buttons. So let's see if we can actually turn it on now with the chassis button. All 4 fans are running. I think it's time to connect a keyboard and a monitor and see if we're getting everything. All right, we have BIOS. It's detecting the CPU, memory. I need to clean up the cables a little bit on the back of the case, and then maybe it's time to install Windows. So Windows is currently installing. Created a bootable USB drive, and I think that's pretty much the end of this video. Everything seems to be working the way I'd hoped. I realized I haven't taken those little protective covers off the parts of the motherboard and so forth yet. We'll do that. And so overall, I'm pretty happy with this build. Obviously, restating what I said before, I still need to get a real GPU. If I want to play games or if I want to do video editing, it's going to be pretty much necessary. But right now with the integrated AMD graphics, it's doing an okay job. So, at least for just basic stuff. Hope this was helpful or interesting, and thanks for watching.